The Lewis family from Bellwood, Texas, represented the quintessential American dream. Marcus Lewis, 45, was a prosperous lawyer known for his intellect and commitment to justice. His wife, Tanya Lewis, 38, ran a successful fitness studio in the center of Bellwood and was highly regarded for her business skills and focus on health and wellness. Together, they seem to have crafted a life marked by stability, respect, and wealth. However, beneath their seemingly flawless life lay unresolved tensions that threatened to disrupt the carefully cultivated image they projected. 5 years earlier, Marcus's first marriage to Vanessa had ended in a bitter divorce. Their son, Jaden Lewis, now 22, had been caught in the middle of their split. Marcus fought for joint custody, but as Jaden matured, he spent more time with his father, eventually moving in with him full-time. This transition was difficult for Jaden, who struggled with the emotional aftermath of the divorce. Adjusting to the new family situation was tough, especially when it came to Tanya, whom he had always seen as an outsider. Despite Tanya's attempts to bond with Jaden, their relationship remained strained. Jaden viewed her as a reminder of his parents' failed marriage and resented her presence in his life. Tanya, for her part, felt that Jaden symbolized Marcus's past, a past she wanted to leave behind. Although she tried to connect with him, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jaden would always see her as a stepmother, not a trusted parental figure. The tension between the two was noticeable, but Marcus chose to overlook it. He focused on his career and providing for the family, believing that any issues were small and would eventually resolve on their own. In Bellwood, a close-knit town where everyone knew each other's business, the Lewis family was admired for their polished appearance. Marcus was a well-respected member of the community, often taking part in local meetings and charity events. Tanya's fitness studio had become a community hub, offering various classes that drew a loyal following. On the surface, they were the model family, having survived life's challenges and emerged stronger. However, as time went on, the cracks in their relationship began to show. Jaden's growing resentment toward Tanya manifested in subtle defiance. He ignored her advice, questioned her authority, and often reminded her that she wasn't his real mother. Tanya, meanwhile, grew more frustrated with Jaden's behavior and Marcus's refusal to address the issue. She felt isolated, constantly fighting a battle that Marcus didn't acknowledge. Family gatherings became uncomfortable as the strained relationship between Tanya and Jaden became harder to hide. Marcus, ever the mediator, attempted to ease tensions, but his efforts often fell short. The family dinners that were supposed to bring them together only highlighted the divide. As Marcus tried to foster unity, it became more evident that the family was far from harmonious. Tanya began spending more time at her fitness studio, immersing herself in work to escape the growing tension at home. Jaden, feeling increasingly alienated, started distancing himself from both Tanya and Marcus, and the close relationship he once had with his father began to fade, replaced by bitterness and a sense of betrayal. The Lewis family was living a lie, and deep down, they all knew it. Yet in Bellwood, where appearances were everything, they continued to play their roles, hoping the truth would remain hidden. On July 1st, 2023, Jaden, weary and irritable after a long day at work, returned home to find the house unusually quiet. Marcus was still at the office, and Tanya was likely at her studio or running errands. As Jaden passed the dining table, he noticed Tanya's phone left unattended. Curiosity and lingering resentment led him to pick it up. The phone was unlocked, and without thinking, he began scrolling through her messages. It didn't take long before something caught his attention. Messages from a man named Rashad Johnson, someone Jaden didn't recognize. As Jaden read through the messages, his heart began to race. The conversation was intimate, full of terms of endearment and plans for secret meetings. Jaden's suspicions were confirmed. Tanya was having an affair. The messages were explicit, leaving no doubt that Tanya and Rashad had been involved for several months, meeting whenever Marcus was away. Rashad, a 34-year-old local businessman, was charming and persuasive. It was clear that Rashad had become more than just a lover to Tanya. He was her confidant, someone she could escape to from the pressures of her marriage. As Jaden processed this revelation, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a strange sense of vindication filled him. He had always felt Tanya didn't belong in their family, and now he had proof that she was deceiving his father. But as the initial shock wore off, another thought began to surface. He could use this information to his advantage. Jaden had been struggling financially, juggling his part-time job with college, and money was always tight. Confronting Tanya and exposing her affair seemed tempting, but Jaden quickly realized there was a more profitable way to handle the situation. Rather than going to his father, he decided to use the information as leverage. That evening, when Tanya returned home, Jaden was waiting. He wasted no time confronting her, revealing that he knew about her affair with Rashad. Tanya was initially shocked and frightened, but as Jaden laid out the situation, she understood the severity. Jaden wasn't interested in a confrontation or an apology. What he wanted was money, $1,000 a month in exchange for his silence. Tanya was stunned. She had never imagined Jaden would find out about her affair, let alone use it against her. Fearful of losing everything, her marriage, her business, her reputation, she knew that if Marcus learned of Rashad, their life together would be over. Desperate to keep the affair hidden, Tanya reluctantly agreed to Jaden's terms. Each month, she would transfer $1,000 to his account, and in return, he would keep the affair a secret. Jaden was cold and calculating, warning Tanya that if she missed a payment or tried to deceive him, he would go straight to Marcus. Tanya had no choice but to comply, yet the arrangement was fragile. The delicate balance Jaden had struck was unstable, and it was only a matter of time before the pressure would become too much for either of them. As the summer of 2023 wore on, Tanya found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The weight of Jaden's blackmail grew heavier, and what had seemed like a necessary evil to protect her marriage quickly spiraled out of control. Tanya continued paying Jaden the $1,000 each month, but the strain of maintaining the secret took its toll on her life. Jaden, encouraged by his initial success, soon grew dissatisfied with the payments. Seeing Tanya's desperation, he realized he could push her further. By September, just 3 months after the original blackmail, Jaden demanded a raise, $500 a month, arguing that his silence had become more valuable as time passed. Tanya was shocked by this demand, but she knew she had little choice. Reluctantly, she agreed to the increased payments. Though the financial burden began to strain her resources, her fitness studio, once a source of pride and stability, started to suffer as Tanya struggled to keep up with both her business's needs and the growing demands of the blackmail payments. To manage, she cut back on marketing and delayed important expenses. Tanya made efforts to reduce costs, hoping to gather enough funds to meet Jaden's demands. But these attempts only led to a drop in business. Fewer clients enrolled in classes, and her once thriving studio began to lose its reputation. The stress of the situation began to take a physical and emotional toll on her. She lost weight, struggled to sleep, and was constantly on edge, fearing that Jaden might escalate his demands or, worse, expose her affair. Despite the ongoing payments, the studio, which had once offered her a sense of peace, now felt like a prison, with every client and employee serving as a reminder of the life she was desperately trying to hold together. Meanwhile, Marcus remained unaware of the chaos consuming his family. He noticed Tanya's increasing stress and distance, but he attributed it to the demands of running her business. He offered his support, suggesting she take time off or delegate more tasks, but Tanya couldn't bring herself to confide in him. The web of lies she had woven had become too entrenched, and she feared that revealing the truth would shatter everything. As time passed, the conflict between Tanya and Jaden grew more intense. Private arguments spilled into public confrontations, with Tanya accusing Jaden of cruelty and ingratitude, while Jaden reminded her that she was the one who had betrayed Marcus in the first place. These clashes left both parties emotionally drained, further straining their fragile relationship. The mounting stress at home began to affect Marcus as well. Although he couldn't understand the underlying reasons, he noticed that Tanya and Jaden were frequently at odds, and their once peaceful home had turned into a battleground. Marcus attempted to mediate, but his efforts were futile. Tanya's evasiveness and Jaden's hostility only deepened the rift, leading to more frequent and heated arguments. Financial pressures also mounted for Tanya. The increased payments to Jaden left her with little money to invest in her business or cover personal expenses. She began borrowing from friends and family, inventing excuses about slow months or unexpected costs at the studio. These temporary solutions only added to her anxiety, knowing she couldn't maintain the facade much longer. By the end of 2023, the picture-perfect image of the Lewis family had shattered. Tanya's life was unraveling. Her business was on the brink of collapse, and her marriage was sustained only by lies. Jaden, fully aware of his leverage, continued to tighten his hold on Tanya, with his demands growing more aggressive each month. The situation was a ticking time bomb, and both Tanya and Jaden understood it couldn't continue forever. The constant conflict and escalating demands pushed them both toward a breaking point. As the new year approached, it became clear that something had to change. By December 2023, Tanya had reached her breaking point. The unrelenting pressure of Jaden's blackmail demands, combined with her failing business and the constant fear of exposure, left her desperate and exhausted. Realizing she could no longer handle the situation alone, Tanya made a decision that would alter everything. She contacted Rashad Johnson. Rashad, 34, was more than just her lover. He had connections that extended beyond Bellwood, Texas. While Tanya was aware of Rashad's involvement in questionable activities, she hadn't fully grasped the depth of his criminal ties. However, she now felt she had no choice but to turn to him. She needed someone who could handle Jaden and eliminate the threat he posed to her life and marriage. When Tanya told Rashad about the blackmail, he listened intently, his expression hardening as she explained the situation. Rashad had never liked Jaden, seeing him as an obstacle to their relationship and a potential risk to their affair. Tanya's revelation about the blackmail confirmed his suspicions, and he was infuriated that Jaden was using Tanya's vulnerability to manipulate and extort her. Rashad decided it was time to take control. He assured Tanya that he would handle the matter, proposing a straightforward plan. He would offer Jaden a substantial sum to walk away and stay silent. Rashad believed $50,000 would be enough to make Jaden back off, an amount significant for someone in Jaden's position, and he was confident Jaden would accept. The next evening, Rashad arranged to meet Jaden at a secluded spot outside of Bellwood. He chose an abandoned warehouse, a quiet place where they could talk without interruptions. Jaden arrived curious but cautious, unsure of what to expect, though the idea of meeting with Rashad intrigued him. Rashad wasted no time, laying out his offer. He calmly explained that he knew about the blackmail and proposed $50,000 in cash for Jaden to disappear and never contact Tanya again. However, Jaden wasn't easily persuaded. He had grown accustomed to the power he held over Tanya and saw this as a chance for even more financial gain. The offer of $50,000, though tempting, wasn't enough. He countered with a demand for $250,000, believing Rashad could afford it and that this larger sum would secure his financial future. Rashad's demeanor shifted instantly. What had started as a negotiation quickly escalated into a confrontation. Rashad, angered by Jaden's greed and arrogance, lost his patience. Jaden had pushed too far, and Rashad was not one to tolerate such disrespect. As Jaden continued to press for the higher payout, Rashad snapped. The situation quickly turned violent as Rashad, driven by a mix of rage and a desire to protect his and Tanya's secrets, attacked Jaden. The confrontation spiraled into a brutal beating. Jaden, unprepared for the sudden violence, tried to defend himself, but Rashad's fury overwhelmed him. The blows continued to rain down, and when Rashad finally stopped, Jaden lay motionless on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse. The reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. Rashad stared at Jaden's lifeless body, his mind racing. He hadn't intended to kill Jaden, but in the heat of the moment, that's exactly what had happened. Now he was left with a dead body in a situation far beyond what he and Tanya had anticipated. Rashad knew there was no turning back. He had to act quickly to cover up the crime. He called Tanya, his voice tense and urgent, explaining what had happened. Tanya, already on edge from the months of blackmail, was horrified. This situation had gone far beyond anything she had imagined when she first reached out to Rashad for help. Together, they devised a plan to dispose of Jaden's body and eliminate any evidence linking them to the crime. Rashad, experienced in handling such matters due to his criminal connections, took charge. He instructed Tanya to return home and act as if nothing had happened while he handled the more dangerous task of getting rid of the body. They had to be careful. Any trace of Jaden's presence at the warehouse could lead the authorities back to them. Rashad wrapped Jaden's body in a heavy tarp and loaded it into the trunk of his car, cleaning up any blood or evidence that might have been left behind. The warehouse, once the scene of violence, now stood silent, void of any trace of the chaos that had unfolded. Rashad drove to a remote area outside of Bellwood, a location far from prying eyes. Under the cover of darkness, he dug a deep grave, working quickly and efficiently. He buried Jaden's body, covering the grave with leaves and branches to blend it into the surrounding forest. The spot was carefully chosen, isolated enough to be unlikely to be discovered by chance, but close enough that Rashad could monitor it if necessary. Meanwhile, Tanya returned home, her mind racing as she tried to keep her composure. She had to figure out what to tell Marcus, knowing that his suspicions could lead to questions she wasn't ready to answer. After several hours, Tanya decided on a story that she hoped would buy her time. The next morning, she told Marcus that Jaden had left unexpectedly on a road trip. She claimed he had mentioned needing time away to clear his head and hadn't specified when he would return. Marcus, though surprised, accepted her explanation. However, as the weeks passed, Marcus grew more anxious. He contacted Jaden's friends and coworkers, but none had heard from him. As Marcus continued searching for answers, Jaden's whereabouts grew more elusive. It wasn't long before Marcus contacted the police and reported Jaden missing. This was the moment Tanya had feared the most. The investigation had begun. Tanya stuck to her story, claiming that Jaden had been under a lot of stress and had mentioned wanting to get away for a while. She insisted that he had left on his own and that she was just as concerned as everyone else. Despite her best efforts, Tanya couldn't shake the growing dread that the investigation brought. Police officers came to her home, asking probing questions and examining Jaden's belongings. Every knock on the door, every phone call sent a wave of panic through her. Rashad, too, was on edge, knowing that any mistake could lead the police straight to him. As the investigation deepened, the police found it harder to believe that Jaden had simply disappeared. There was no activity on his bank accounts, no signs of him using his phone, and no one had seen him. The lack of evidence suggested something more sinister, and detectives began to suspect foul play. Tanya's carefully constructed lie began to unravel under the pressure. It became increasingly difficult for her to maintain her composure during police interviews, and inconsistencies in her story began to emerge. The detectives noticed her nervousness and the small discrepancies in her account, and they began to focus more closely on her and her relationship with Jaden. They asked about any arguments or tensions in the household and whether Jaden had confided in her about anything troubling. As the investigation progressed, the police uncovered small, seemingly insignificant details that didn't add up. A neighbor recalled seeing Jaden arguing with someone just before his disappearance. A coworker mentioned that Jaden had spoken about some family issues that had been bothering him. These clues, though not definitive, painted a picture of a young man under pressure, one that could have led to something much more serious than a spontaneous road trip. Tanya and Rashad were now living in constant fear of being discovered. The stress was overwhelming, and the web of lies they had created became harder to manage each day. Every new challenge made it more difficult to cover their tracks and avoid detection. What had started as a simple plan to silence Jaden had spiraled into a deeper entanglement of deceit and criminal activity. The investigation into Jaden's disappearance was far from over, and the detectives were closing in. Tanya and Rashad knew that it was only a matter of time before their secret would be exposed, and the consequences would be dire. By May 17, 2024, the investigation had reached a critical point. Detective Rachel Ward had spent months piecing together the fragments of the case, unraveling the layers of deceit that surrounded the Lewis family. Her persistence paid off when she uncovered the truth that had been so carefully concealed. Tanya eventually admitted to the affair with Rashad and the blackmail that followed. She confessed to reaching out to Rashad for help, but initially she stopped short of acknowledging the full extent of their actions. However, Detective Ward, sensing that Tanya was on the verge of a breakdown, continued to press her, methodically dismantling the lies Tanya had used to shield herself. Under the weight of the evidence and the realization that there was no way out, Tanya finally revealed the horrifying details of what had happened on that fateful night in December 2023. She described how Rashad, in a fit of rage, had beaten Jaden to death after their attempt to buy his silence had failed. She recounted how they had disposed of his body in a remote location, hoping to cover their tracks and maintain the illusion of normalcy in their lives. With Tanya's confession, Detective Ward had the final pieces of the puzzle. The authorities moved swiftly to arrest Rashad Johnson, who had been under surveillance since the investigation had intensified. Rashad, who had kept his composure throughout the investigation, was taken into custody without incident. However, once he realized the full extent of the evidence against him, his demeanor changed. Confronted with the reality of the situation, Rashad chose to remain silent, allowing the legal process to unfold. The defense, on the other hand, tried to portray Tanya as a victim of circumstance, manipulated by Rashad and driven to desperate measures by Jaden's blackmail. However, this argument did little to sway the jury, who were horrified by the cold-blooded nature of the crime. The trial quickly reached a verdict. Rashad Johnson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tanya Lewis, who had cooperated with the investigation to some extent, was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The court acknowledged her role in the crime and cover-up, but also considered her to have been under Rashad's influence. For Marcus Lewis, the outcome of the trial was devastating. The man who had once believed he had a perfect family now had to face the painful reality of their hidden lives. The betrayal by Tanya, the loss of his son Jaden, and the public spectacle of the trial were more than he could bear. After the sentencing, Marcus left Bellwood, unable to continue living in a town filled with painful memories.